Welcome. Today, we're going to be questioning the mainstream history of Spain. We'll be diving into Spain's alternative history, exploring some truly fascinating architecture, and even touching on the possibility of lost civilizations. I actually traveled to Spain myself and explored many of the places we'll be discussing, so you'll see some boots on the ground footage of these structures and sites throughout the series. This isn't meant to be a comprehensive breakdown of all of Spain's history. I've still got much to learn and many more cities to visit. But for now, this will hopefully scratch the surface. My goal is to do it justice, but don't take my word for anything. Always do your own research. This is simply an attempt to explore the hidden layers of Spanish history through an alternative lens. With that said, let's get ready to explore. We've got a lot to cover, so we're starting with the mainstream history of Spain. Not to repeat what you've already heard, but just to set the stage for asking better questions. But before we dive in, let me quickly explain what this video is really exploring. This is an alternative historical perspective, one that suggests something radically different. That Arabic script and what we now call Islamic culture may not have originated in Arabia at all, but rather in Europe. Specifically the Iberian Peninsula, and only later expanded into the Middle East. In this view, Arabic was the imperial language of a wider Eurasian power structure, often loosely associated with what's been called Tartaria. What we label today as Islamic may in fact have deep European roots. Now I get it, that probably sounds like a huge stretch. So instead of jumping straight into that, we're going to build our way there, starting with what the textbooks tell us. If you're already familiar with Spain's conventional timeline, feel free to skip ahead, but for those who want to follow the clues from the beginning, let's start with the version of history we're all supposed to accept. The most ancient inhabitants of Spain, according to the mainstream narrative, were the Celts and the Iberians. The term Iberians itself is a bit of a misnomer, as it tends to lump together a variety of culturally and linguistically distinct peoples who lived along the eastern and southern coast. We are told that the Celts migrated into the Iberian Peninsula from what is now southern France around 300 BC, settling primarily in the north and northwest. These so-called Celtiberians, a hybrid cultural identity, are said to have formed through the interaction of these migrating Celts with the indigenous Iberians. But as with much of early history, the archaeological record leaves a lot open to interpretation. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians, seafaring traders from the eastern Mediterranean, are said to have arrived much earlier, around 1100 BC, establishing coastal colonies like Gadir, modern Cádiz, which some claim is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. Their influence, particularly in trade and metallurgy, was significant, but the mainstream account offers surprisingly little detail about the nature of their inland presence or long-term integration. For a group supposedly so vital in the transmission of writing, maritime navigation, and urban development, the lack of in-depth records on their societal impact with Iberia is notable. Most of what we now know comes from Greek and later Roman sources. As the Phoenician presence in southern Spain grew, their influence eventually gave rise to the powerful city-state of Carthage, a formal Phoenician colony that would go on to dominate much of the western Mediterranean. Carthage inherited many of the original settlements along the Spanish coast, and expanded them into strategic outposts for trade and military logistics. This brought them into direct conflict with the rising Roman Republic. The tipping point came with the Second Punic War, the one with Hannibal famously crossing the Alps with elephants, a story that has all the markings of myth, yet it's still repeated uncritically. Rome, viewing Carthaginian control of southern Spain as a threat, launched a full-scale campaign to wrest control of the peninsula. By the end of the war, Rome had not only defeated Carthage, but had secured most of Iberia, which they now renamed Hispania. From there, Spain was gradually absorbed into the Roman Empire over the next 2 centuries, though resistance continued from northern tribes like the Cantabrians and Asturians well into the 1st century BC. Cities like Tarraco, Tarragona, Emerita Augusta, Merida, and Cordova were built or possibly rebuilt into Roman-style urban centers, complete with aqueducts, theaters, and straight roads that are still in use today. The Latin language, Roman law, and Catholic Christianity would eventually define the region, but how quickly and thoroughly this transformation occurred is often glossed over. The sheer scale of Roman infrastructure in Hispania, considering the time period and terrain, is quite suspicious. As the Western Roman Empire began to unravel in the 5th century, various so-called barbarian groups swept across its former territories. One of the most significant were the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe that, according to mainstream accounts, famously sacked Rome in 410 AD, a symbolic death blow to Roman prestige. Not long after, they turned their attention to the Iberian Peninsula, where they established a kingdom that would endure for nearly 300 years, with Toledo eventually becoming its capital. What's curious is how quickly the Visigoths transitioned from pillagers of Rome to inheritors of its infrastructure and style. Despite being cast as outsiders, they maintained much of the Roman legal code, and even continued Latin as the administrative language. Their architecture often mirrored Roman forms, stone churches, basilicas, and fortifications that were more continuation than rupture. By the 6th century, the Visigoths had converted from Arianism to Catholic Christianity, aligning themselves fully with Roman religious orthodoxy. From that point on, the Visigothic kingdom wasn't just another post-Roman state. It positioned itself as a defender of Western Christianity, especially as the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire was distant and increasingly Greek in character. Church councils in Toledo dictated not just religious policy, but political governance, suggesting a theocratic structure more centralized than one might expect from a barbarian realm. The extent of Christian influence, centered so firmly in what we now call Spain, is something that's often overshadowed in simplified narratives. For a kingdom that supposedly emerged out of chaos, its institutions, cities, and churches show a level of continuity that raises fair questions about how much was really rebuilt versus inherited under new management. Then, in one of the most abrupt civilizational turnovers in recorded history, we're told that the mighty Visigothic kingdom, this deeply entrenched Christian power ruling from Toledo, with centuries of Roman inheritance behind it, was swept aside almost overnight by a force of invading North African Muslims, primarily composed of Berber troops under Arab leadership. The mainstream account claims that a relatively small army, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 711 AD with reportedly just 7,000 men, and somehow managed not only to defeat the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete, but to go on and conquer nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula within just a few years. This would mean that an empire rooted in Roman traditions, with fortified cities, standing armies, and an established Christian bureaucracy, collapsed almost instantly under the pressure of what was essentially a scouting expedition. Even more curious, this dramatic upheaval supposedly left little to no prolonged resistance from the remaining nobility or Christian populations, and no significant sieges or long-standing battles are recorded during this rapid takeover. By 718, barely 7 years later, nearly all of Iberia was under Islamic rule, rebranded as Al-Andalus, with only the remote mountainous regions of the north remaining in Christian hands. The speed, scale, and smoothness of this transition, especially in a territory that had been the seat of Christian councils and royal dynasties, deserve more scrutiny than they typically receive. We're left with a narrative in which an entire civilizational structure is dismantled and replaced with a new religious, linguistic, and cultural system in a single generation. And this supposedly with minimal documentation of widespread conflict, collapse, or resistance. Under Islamic rule, Al-Andalus quickly became one of the most celebrated centers of learning and culture in medieval Europe, or so the narrative goes. Cities like Córdoba, Sevilla, and Granada are described as flourishing hubs of science, medicine, architecture, and philosophy, centuries ahead of the Christian kingdoms to the north. We're told that Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted under a system of dhimma, or protected status for non-Muslims, and that this multicultural dynamic produced a golden age of intellectual progress. So the story is framed in contrast to a supposedly darker, less advanced Christian Europe, though rarely is it explained how such a complex society emerged so quickly after the initial conquest, or how the infrastructure and educational systems necessary for this explosion of knowledge were already in place. Architecturally, the legacy of Al-Andalus is still on full display. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, the Alhambra of Granada, and countless minarets and bathhouses, all blending intricate design with advanced engineering. And yet, while these structures are universally attributed to the Islamic rulers, the details around their initial construction timelines are often vague, with renovations and additions spanning centuries. Like much of the era, the mainstream portrayal leans heavily on generalizations. A tolerant, enlightened Islamic civilization rising almost fully formed in the wake of a vanished Visigothic world, with little resistance and an astonishing level of continuity. This whole golden age feels like a polished overlay on top of something older, less clearly defined, and far more complex than the official accounts would suggest. The Reconquista, the Christian effort to reclaim Iberia from Islamic rule, is said to have begun almost immediately after the Muslim conquest, with the Battle of Covadonga in 722 AD. According to the official story, a small band of Christian resistors in the northern mountains of Asturias held out and gradually built momentum over the next 7 centuries. What's strange though is how this reconquest supposedly coexisted for hundreds of years with a still strong, thriving Al-Andalus. For all the talk of a Christian revival, the pace was fairly slow. While cities like Córdoba and Sevilla were flourishing under Muslim rule, the Christian kingdoms, Asturias, León, Castilla, Aragon, Navarre, remained fragmented, underdeveloped, and internally conflicted for centuries. Despite this, the narrative insists that the Reconquista was an inevitable, almost divinely ordained mission to reclaim lost Christian lands. Yet it wasn't until the 11th century, with the fall of Toledo in 1085, that any serious momentum seemed to develop. Even then, progress was inconsistent. At times, Christian kingdoms allied with Muslim ones against rival Christian neighbors, a fact often glossed over in romanticized retellings. And throughout it all, Al-Andalus was still producing architectural marvels like the Alhambra well into the 13th century. By the time Granada fell in 1492, the narrative ties up neatly. Christian forces unified under Ferdinand and Isabella complete the Reconquista and reassert Catholic dominance over all of Spain. But looking at the timeline, the idea of a 700-year reconquest that progressed slowly with long periods of stagnation and political ambiguity seems oddly prolonged for a supposed holy campaign. Was this really a linear push from one side, or something more complex, more like a gradual reorganization of power, rewritten in retrospect as a clear-cut victory? The year 1492 is often portrayed as the triumphant climax of Spain's rebirth. The fall of Granada, the final Muslim stronghold, the expulsion of the Jews, ostensibly to purify the faith, and the launch of Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic, all within a matter of months. It's an oddly packed moment of history, almost too tidy, an ending and a beginning all at once. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, emerge in the narrative as unifying figures, though their consolidation of power came on the heels of internal purges, inquisitions, and forced conversions that rarely get the same celebratory treatment as the conquest itself. With the Islamic era wiped from the political map, Spain pivots rapidly to become a global empire. Over the next century, it carves out vast territories in the Americas, Asia, and parts of Europe, becoming one of the most dominant powers in the world. Charles V and later Philip II rule over what's often described as an empire on which the sun never sets. Massive wealth floods in from the colonies, silver from Peru, gold from Mexico, financing not just military campaigns but monumental cathedrals, palaces, and state apparatus across Iberia. And yet for an empire said to have expanded so explosively, the logistical and administrative infrastructure seems to have appeared just as suddenly. Enormous fleets, complex trade routes, global governance, emerging in just decades after centuries of slow reconquista. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, but intensifying after 1492, ensured religious uniformity through fear, rooting out heresy at home even as Catholicism was exported abroad. It's a period marked by incredible reach and power, but also by contradiction. Brutal conquest justified by divine mission, unprecedented wealth coupled with spiraling debt, and a cultural boom that often borrowed from earlier influences. By the early 1700s, the once mighty Spanish Empire was in decline, stretched thin, riddled with debt, and fractured by internal disputes. The official story is that the death of the childless Charles II triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a European power struggle over who would control the Spanish throne. Out of this chaos, the Bourbon dynasty, a French royal house, was installed in Spain, with Philip V taking the crown in 1700. The move was framed as a diplomatic solution, but in hindsight, it reads more like a quiet hijacking of Spanish sovereignty by foreign bloodlines under the banner of dynastic legitimacy. From this point on, Spain begins to mirror French absolutism more closely: centralized power, heavy bureaucracy, and new architectural and cultural shifts that seem to align less with native tradition and more with Bourbon taste. The narrative paints this as modernization, but it also marked a deeper transformation of the state itself. Long-standing institutions were restructured or phased out. In Spain, once the apex of the Catholic Empire, was gradually repositioned within the wider interest of European dynasties. It's a period of supposed renewal that, depending on how you look at it, could just as easily be viewed as rebranding of control, especially considering that the Bourbon dynasty still sits on the Spanish throne today, a legacy of original foreign insertion into Spanish politics. That's all we really need to cover when it comes to the mainstream version of Spanish history. We've outlined the core periods: pre-Roman settlement, Roman Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom, the Moorish conquest, the centuries-long Reconquista, and the rise of the Spanish Empire. These are the official chapters we're expected to accept at face value. But as we'll start to explore, there are more than a few threads that don't quite hold together. The timelines, the sudden shifts, the missing layers of documentation, certain things just don't add up. So now it's time to take a closer look and start asking the questions the textbooks tend to avoid. Let's begin with the so-called pre-Roman period, because there are some curious details that don't get that much attention in the mainstream narrative. We're told that the inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula when the Phoenicians arrived were simply the Iberians. But who exactly were the Iberians? The term is vague at best. It's essentially a catch-all label for the various populations living across the peninsula. It doesn't describe a specific culture, ethnicity, or language group. It's just a broad geographic term. In terms of actual named peoples, we mostly hear about the Celts, and then, just briefly, about a mysterious group known as the Tartessians. Mainstream history does mention Tartessos, but usually in passing, describing it as a kind of semi-mythical mix of Phoenician and Celtiberian elements. And even that description leaves a lot unsaid. Also, isn't it interesting? Tartessian? In prehistory, southern Spain was known as Tartessos, a land that appeared in ancient Greek sources, including Herodotus, who placed it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Some accounts even say that parts of Tartessos were lost to flooding, tying it to the age-old story of Atlantis. Herodotus names a king of Tartessos, Arganthonius, who is said to have welcomed Greek sailors to the region. He is described as one of the long-lived, semi-divine rulers reigning for over 80 years. That would make him the first documented monarch of the Iberian Peninsula. Yet somehow, this early, possibly advanced civilization remains largely glossed over in mainstream history. What's fascinating is that this civilization, Tartessos, is said to have mysteriously disappeared over 2,500 years ago, and the mainstream offers no real explanation as to why. One of the most famous artifacts is the Lady of Elche, often labeled a fertility goddess. But if you look closer, the large world headpieces resemble symbols found in Hopi tradition, where similar forms represent fertility and cosmic connection. Then there are the sculptures and motifs like the winged lion, which resemble Babylonian art. But again, rather than suggesting Tartessos was borrowing from others, what if it was the source of these ideas, not the recipient? And the biggest clue might be Tartessian gold, specifically the treasure of El Carambolo. The style and craftsmanship bear an uncanny resemblance to Scythian goldwork, known for its intricate animal forms and high metalworking skill. This suggests that the Tartessian artistic tradition may predate and influence what we now consider Eastern steppe art. Even more compelling is the Tartessian language and its alphabet. Under closer inspection, many characters resemble early runic forms. Scholars like John T. Koch argue that Tartessian might actually be the earliest known Celtic language, predating other Celtic inscriptions and suggesting a Western European origin for the Celts, not Central Europe as we're usually told. The Celtiberian script is nearly identical to Tartessian, and this isn't a minor footnote, it completely challenges the standard migration model. So do the Celts originate in Spain? The evidence suggests it's possible, but to even consider that, we need to question the assumption that civilization moved east to west, when all signs seem to point the other way. Let's talk about the Basque people, because they're another major anomaly in Spanish history, one that's rarely brought up. Outside of a few passing mentions, like their resistance against Charlemagne's army, the Basque barely register in the mainstream narrative. But that is odd when you think about it. The Basques somehow retain their autonomy, culture, and language across every major period of Spanish history: Roman, Visigothic, Islamic, Reconquista, Empire. How is that even possible? If the Basques have been in the region for over 2,000 years, unchanged in language and customs, why has every single surrounding culture either vanished, evolved, or been absorbed? That alone should raise some questions. Their language, Euskara, is classified as a linguistic isolate. It doesn't belong to the Indo-European language family or connect to any other known language in Europe. There's no precursor to it, no branches, no derivatives, it just appears. And then there's the hand of Erulegi, discovered recently, which pushes written Basque further back than anyone expected, showing complex expression long before it's supposed to exist in the region. Genetically, the Basque also stand apart. Modern studies show that they have distinct markers not found in surrounding populations. Their genetic profile is closest to early European farmers, dating back to the Neolithic period, suggesting they were isolated long before the Indo-European expansions. Somehow, their culture survived untouched while massive migrations and empires swept through the rest of the continent. The Basques have flood myths, not vaguely but explicitly. In their oral tradition, the gods once punished humanity with the Great Deluge, wiping out the Old World. This is exactly how Plato described the destruction of Atlantis, as punishment from the gods by flood for a society that had grown corrupt. Both stories center on an advanced people, a sudden cataclysm, and divine retribution. The Basque have a legend that they originally came from Atlantis, which they called Atlantica. In Euskara, the sunken island, sometimes referred to as the Green Isle, from which Basque ancestors arrived in the Bay of Biscay. Atlantica, resemblance to Plato's Atlantis, is unmistakable. Interestingly, in Basque mythology, a Tartalo was an enormous strong one-eyed giant similar to the Greek Cyclops, and they even have their own version of Bigfoot or a hairy humanoid known as the Basajuan, who was the lord of the forest. But it doesn't stop there. Basque myth also speaks of beings who escaped underground, taking refuge beneath the earth. Not metaphorically, but literally. This is also mentioned in Celtic legends of hidden races retreating into hills and mountains after a great fall. In fact, you can draw a direct parallel to Gaelic Tua de Danann, who also disappear underground after a final battle. Another pre-flood, pre-Christian race that mysteriously vanishes from the surface. And then there's the geography. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now understand as the Strait of Gibraltar. That puts us squarely in southern Iberia, right along the Atlantic coast, and right next to Basque territory. If there were any survivors of Atlantis, it's not hard to see why the mountainous Pyrenees, hard to reach, easy to defend, would be the logical place to retreat. Interesting, the Laboru is an ancient swastika with 4 rounded heads, most widely known as the traditional symbol of the Basque country and the Basque people. Not only that, but Basque gravestones look Celtic and feature solar symbols. Their language, Euskara, which is completely unrelated to any other language in Europe or the world, only deepens this mystery. It doesn't come from Latin, it doesn't come from Celtic, it doesn't even come from Phoenician or Greek. It just exists, like a preserved shard of something older, something pre-cataclysmic. There's also a linguistic layer to all this that barely anyone talks about. Some Proto-Celtic linguists, the ones who study the reconstructed roots of Celtic languages, have pointed out that Celtic languages seem to contain a Basque substratum. In other words, there are words in Irish, Welsh, and even older forms of Celtic that don't come from Indo-European at all. They don't fit, but they do resemble Basque. And forgive me if I pronounce these incorrectly, but here are some examples. In Irish Gaelic, the word eo, salmon, closely parallels Basque izokin. A dark horn aligns with Adar. Even the word for woman, Inder, in early Irish, resemble the Basque Andir. And these aren't just flukes, they point to an older linguistic influence. And then there's the vigesimal numeral system. Basque count in 20s, not 10s. 40 is twice 20. 80 is 4 times 20. This is rare in Europe, but it is also used in Celtic languages, like Irish and Welsh. Indo-European languages use a decimal system. So why do Basque and Celtic both count in 20s? The answer might be simple. The Celts inherited this from the Basques. If that's the case, then we're not just talking about trade or contact, we're looking at a much deeper relationship. One where Basque isn't a leftover, it's the origin layer, and everything else is built on top of it. As mentioned in previous videos, after the fall of Atlantis, it seems clear that survivors didn't just settle in Ireland, they also arrived in Spain. In fact, one could argue that the first major civilization to rise after the deluge was rooted right here, in what we now call Iberia. Whether through erasure, flooding, or deliberate rewriting, that civilization has been largely lost to official history. It's important to clarify that when I use the term Celt, I'm not just referring to the label used in mainstream history. What I'm really talking about is a megalithic race of post-flood survivors, a culture that carried forward a distinct set of traditions, symbols, and technologies we now associate with what's called Celtic. While mainstream narratives place Irish and Celtic culture as emerging after the Roman era, what if the entire timeline is reversed? Quote, "The orthodox view of the origins of the Celts turns out to be an archaeological myth left over from the 19th century. Over the past 200 years, a myth has grown up of the Celts as a vast, culturally sophisticated, but warlike people from Central Europe, north of the Alps and the Danube, who invaded most of Europe, including the British Isles, during the Iron Age around 300 BC. Many archaeologists still hold this view of a grand Iron Age Celtic culture in the center of the continent, which shrank to a Western rump after Roman times. It is also the basis of a strong sense of ethnic identity that millions of members of the so-called Celtic diaspora hold. But there's absolutely no evidence, linguistic, archaeological, or genetic, that identifies the Hallstatt or Latine regions or cultures as Celtic homelands. The notion derives from a mistake made by the historian Herodotus 2,500 years ago, when in a passing remark about the Keltoi, he placed them at the source of the Danube, which he thought was near the Pyrenees. Everything else about his description located the Keltoi in the region of Iberia. End quote. From Stephen Oppenheimer, The Origins of the British. Iberia signified the Iberu. From Michael Tessarian. Quote, the yew tree was considered very sacred to both Druids and Egyptian Magi. The Iberu, or Ibri, Abri, or Abari, turn up in Egypt as the wise ones, or elders. The letter H, added as a prefix, simply meant the, and so the word Hebrew meant the Hebrew, or the Iberu. This is the origin of the word Iberia that signified Spain, and Ibernia that signified Ireland. The Iberu were Druidic elders who had traveled to Egypt in remote periods bringing solar worship there. End quote. Even today, Spain still holds strong traces of this tradition. In modern-day Galicia, you'll find not just Celtic music and bagpipes, but festivals, stone carvings, and legends that feel much closer to ancient Ireland or Scotland than to the rest of Spain. The people of Galicia identify strongly with their Celtic roots, and many of their customs, such as Samain, a festival marking the end of the harvest just like Samhain, are directly linked to ancient pagan Celtic practices, predating even Roman contact. Archaeologically, Galicia and surrounding regions are covered in castros, stone hill forts identical in layout and function to those found in Ireland, Wales, and Brittany. The Celtic swirls, solar disk, and even spiral motifs carved into stones across northern Spain mirror the ones at Newgrange and other megalithic Irish sites. Galicia is also dotted with dolmens, ancient megalithic tombs that date back to the Neolithic period supposedly. Notable examples include the Dolmen de Aketos, often referred to as the Parthenon of Galician megalithism, and the Dombate Dolmen, known as Galicia's Neolithic cathedral due to its impressive size and structure. These structures are not only significant for their age, but also for their architectural similarities to megalithic sites found in Ireland and Britain. Doesn't seem like a coincidence. It looks much more like a shared cultural origin that spanned the Atlantic coast before the so-called rise of the Celts. In Galicia and Portugal, legends speak of the Muras Encantadas, a race of supernatural beings which inhabited the lands of Galicia, Asturias, and Portugal since the beginning of time. These beings were forced to live underground, and apparently they worked with silver, gold, and gemstones, which provided them with enormous treasures that were protected by what is called culebres, or a giant winged serpent dragon. Now this will come into play later, but these supernatural beings were called moros or moros, and are often described as giants or warriors. In the 4th century Latin poem, Ora Maritima, Rufus Festus Avienus recounts a striking legend about the Oestremni, a people said to have lived in what is now Galicia and northern Portugal. According to the account, they were forced to flee the region after being overwhelmed by a strange and powerful force. Quote, much later, the serpent chased away the inhabitants and gave the now empty land its name. End quote. The Greeks later called this region Ophiusa, the land of serpents. But these weren't literal snakes. The serpents here almost certainly refer to a people, likely an invading group or elite class associated with serpent symbolism. This isn't a unique story either. The myth of St. Patrick driving the serpents out of Ireland is a near identical motif, and in that case too, the serpents are widely understood to be druids or pre-Christian people, not actual snakes. Okay, but here's where things get really wild. In Galicia, you'll find what's considered the oldest Roman lighthouse still standing, the Tower of Hercules, built in the 1st century AD. It's almost absurd how well preserved it is compared to other Roman lighthouses. For example, the Roman lighthouse in Dover, England, also said to date to the 1st century, is basically a crumbling shell. But the one in Galicia, fully intact, functioning, restored, and standing over foundations that some sources claim are Phoenician. Others aren't sure if it was a rebuild or a continuation, but either way, it's not a typical Roman tower, and it's said to be modeled after the Lighthouse of Alexandria. That's already extremely suspect. But what's even more interesting is what stands in front of it. A statue of Breogan. According to ancient Irish lore, specifically the Lavor Gabala Aidan, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, Breogan was one of the ancestral patriarchs of the Irish Gaels. After wandering the earth for generations, following a great cataclysm, yes a flood, the Gaels arrive in Iberia, where Breogan is said to have founded a city called Brigantia and built a great tower. From the top of that tower, his son, Ith, catches sight of a distant green land across the sea, Ireland. The Gaels eventually sail there, led by Breogan's descendants, and go on to divide the land with the Tuatha De Danann, the legendary pre-Christian gods of Ireland, who retreat into the underworld. Brigantia is Galicia, Spain, and the Great Tower is the Tower of Hercules. So we're not just looking at a Roman lighthouse here. We're looking at a monument tied to the mythical origins of the Irish people, physically anchored in Spain. The question is, was this really built by Romans? Or is it as the legends say, that this was actually built by an Irish king? Okay, let's discuss these pillars of Hercules. The legendary strongman Hercules was born to the god Zeus and a mortal named Alcmena. The union so incensed Zeus's wife, Hera, that she made life almost unbearable for the hero. Her ire resulted in him undertaking a series of tasks, known as the 12 Labors of Hercules. One mission takes Hercules to Erythea to steal the monstrous Geryon's cattle. Along the way, Hercules erected great rocks, or pillars, near the Straits of Gibraltar. To reach Erythea, the island where Geryon resided, Hercules is said to have smashed through a mountain, creating the Strait of Gibraltar, and erecting the 2 pillars to commemorate his feat. Now, if we attempt to decode this myth, it may become more clear. Hercules, a giant, may be referring to a giant in terms of a civilization of peoples. And these people created the Strait of Gibraltar, and erected 2 pillars which could be symbolic for cities. This isn't a stretch, as when I was in Cadiz, I saw the Hercules symbolism everywhere, and when I asked a museum guide on why it was everywhere, she said that Hercules was the founder of Cadiz. So who is this Hercules and how could he be the founder? This is the secret of the Pillars of Hercules. They are not just pillars, but the founding of cities themselves. It's even on the coat of arms, which bears the inscription, Hercules, founder and ruler of Cadiz. The association between Hercules and Cadiz is further reinforced by the ancient temple of Hercules, Gaditanes, supposedly originally dedicated to the Phoenician god Melkart, whom the Greeks and Romans equated with Hercules. This temple, located near the southern outskirts of ancient Gadir, was a significant sanctuary in the western Mediterranean. Notably, it featured 2 prominent bronze pillars, which many ancient visitors considered the true Pillars of Hercules. The temple's prominence attracted several historical figures. Hannibal is said to have offered vows there before his campaign against Rome, and Julius Caesar reportedly experienced a prophetic dream within its precincts. We don't know much about this temple as it no longer stands, however some say that the structure may be submerged in the Bay of Cadiz. Interestingly, there's a figure in ancient lore who ties directly into this narrative. A Tartessian prince named Norax. According to the myth, Norax was the son of Hermes and Erythea, the daughter of Geryon, the very same Geryon that Hercules was sent to defeat in the far west. Norax is said to have led a group of Iberians from Tartessos to Sardinia, where he founded the city of Nora. Mainstream history labels Nora, as well as Cadiz, Gadir, as Phoenician cities. But what if Phoenician is just a convenient label for something older? What if these so-called Phoenician colonies were actually outposts of a pre-Indo-European megalithic maritime culture? In fact, there's strong evidence connecting the Phoenician language to early Irish Gaelic. In the 18th century, linguists studying the play Penniless by the Roman playwright Plautus noticed striking similarities between the Phoenician lines spoken by a character and ancient Irish Celtic phrasing. Scholars like General Charles Valency even published side-by-side comparisons showing full lines of text from both languages that were almost identical in structure and vocabulary. Another interesting connection is the naming of the Pyrenees. According to Greek and Roman mythology, Pyrene was a beautiful Iberian princess who met a tragic fate at the hands of Hercules. After being abandoned, she gave birth to a serpent and fled in shame, eventually dying in the mountains. Hercules, upon finding her body, was overcome with grief and named the mountain range the Pyrenees in her honor. Now that we've discussed some ancient history that helps tie together some puzzle pieces, let's question some of the main events of Spain's conventional history. The first thing is the Visigoths. Who exactly were the Visigoths? The mainstream narrative tells us that they were a Germanic tribe part of a larger Gothic movement, who migrated into Roman territories and eventually overthrew the Western Roman Empire. But the story glosses over the fact that these supposed barbarians somehow inherited Roman administration, cities, and infrastructure almost overnight. We're told by 410 AD they were sacking Rome, and by the early 500s they were ruling most of Iberia from Toledo. But how does a nomadic warrior group suddenly take over a continent-wide bureaucratic empire without any record of massive rebuilding, reorganization, or resistance? And the Visigoths themselves, are they really who we're told they are? Their ethnic origin is debated, often lumped under the vague Germanic label. But some theories suggest a strong Celtic influence, or at least integration with earlier Celtic groups. Their language left little trace, their architecture is either missing or curiously Roman in form, and their material culture is scarce. Even their so-called laws, the Visigothic Code, are written in Latin, structured like a Roman legal system. It's almost as if they weren't a new culture at all, but a rebranded continuation of something that already existed. It's almost as if the Visigoths are just another label used to muddy the waters. A convenient name to describe a transition of power that maybe didn't happen the way we're told. And of course, the broader mythos surrounding Rome with its neatly packaged 2,000-year-old empire, marble temples, and concrete highways only adds another layer of confusion. But if we zoom out and rewind a bit, there's something critical the mainstream rarely talks about. Before the so-called Romans, the Etruscans ruled much of what is now central and northern Italy. The Etruscans were a maritime and urbanized civilization with writing, advanced metallurgy, and massive temple structures long before Rome was supposedly founded. But their origin is officially unknown, their language undeciphered, and their cultural contributions largely absorbed into Roman identity. Sound familiar? Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Etruscan art, burial customs, and symbolism show clear connections with Celtic Europe. The Celtic torque, spiral motifs, even the use of war trumpets and solar symbols all appear in both Etruscan and early Celtic contexts. There are also linguistic overlaps in sacred terminology and royal titles. In fact, some scholars have speculated that the Etruscans were not so much a separate people, but a part of a pan-European megalithic or proto-Celtic network that spanned from Iberia to Italy and beyond. So what if the Etruscans, Celts, and Visigoths weren't separate civilizations at all, but different names given to various nodes of the same Old World culture. A post-Atlantean maritime society fragmented by cataclysm and later rebranded by imperial historians. The next aspect of the mainstream narrative that makes no sense is the entire Moorish conquest of Spain. We're told that in 711 AD, a relatively small force of Berber soldiers, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and somehow toppled the entire Visigothic kingdom in under a year. A kingdom, mind you, with fortified cities, standing armies, millions of civilians, and Roman-style governance. The numbers alone raise red flags. Some estimates say Tariq had just 7,000 men, yet within months they had taken Toledo, defeated King Roderick, and swept through the peninsula with minimal resistance. It's not just improbable, it's logistically absurd. The deeper you look, the more the story begins to fall apart. Contemporary sources are shockingly thin. The main account, the Chronicle of 754, wasn't even written during the conquest. Later Islamic and Christian sources only add more layers of retrospective embellishment. So what exactly happened? Was it really an invasion at all? There's a compelling case that the so-called conquest may have actually been a civil war, a coup, or even a transitional phase, not a foreign invasion. There are hints that Berbers were already in Spain before 711, possibly as mercenaries, settlers, or part of an existing faction. And if that's true, we're not dealing with an outside force storming the gates, we're looking at an internal power realignment, possibly a color for a more complex cultural transformation. And then there's the architecture. If the Berbers really brought high Islamic culture with them, then where is it in North Africa? Why does the greatest flowering of so-called Moorish architecture show up in Spain, not the Berber heartlands? The Great Mosque of Córdoba, the Alhambra, and other wonders are built using local materials, Roman columns, and Visigothic infrastructure. There is almost nothing equivalent in 8th century Morocco or Algeria. If anything, the architectural innovation seems to flow in reverse, from Al-Andalus into North Africa over the following centuries. This flips the whole script. What if these Moors weren't really North African invaders, but the descendants of an older Iberian civilization, possibly the same one that built Tartessos, the dolmens, and the megalithic cities? What if the term Berber was retroactively applied to a people already in the peninsula, a convenient label for rewriting the past? This would destroy the official timeline. It suggests that Islam in Spain may have emerged gradually from within, and that the Moorish civilization wasn't imported, it was rebranded. The real builders of Al-Andalus might not have been desert tribesmen at all, but the inheritors of a lost Atlantic culture, one far older, more sophisticated, and deeply rooted in Iberia than we're ever told. It's worth noting that early descriptions of the Berbers, particularly the Tuareg and Kabyle groups, describe individuals with light skin, blonde or red hair, and even blue or green eyes, traits not typically associated with sub-Saharan Africa or the Arab world. Ancient Greek and Roman writers made similar observations. This phenotype aligns closely with the Guanches, the indigenous people of the Canary Islands, who were also described as tall, fair-skinned, and often light-eyed, and who built step pyramids, megalithic tombs, and practiced mummification. Genetic studies have shown strong links between the Guanches and Berber groups in North Africa, suggesting both could be remnants of a once widespread Atlantic megalithic culture that reached from Iberia to the Canary Islands, and possibly far beyond. It has been argued that the ancestors of the Berbers were none other than the people of Atlantis, and the so-called Moors, who appeared in 711 AD, may have been inheritors of an Atlantic legacy, not just desert nomads on horseback. Their sudden rise, architectural brilliance, and administrative structure in Spain doesn't read like a foreign occupation. It looks more like the reactivation of a dormant civilization, one already deeply rooted in the Iberian landscape. Historically, the Moors, especially in later European depictions, are often connected with the Saracens and described or portrayed as black Africans, especially during the Reconquista and Crusader periods. However, the reality of who the Moors were may be more complex. The Moorish Empire in Spain was a multi-ethnic and multicultural society, not a monolith. At its height, Al-Andalus was home to Muslims, Christians, and Jews from various ethnic backgrounds, living under a sophisticated system of administration, science, and urban planning that far outpaced much of medieval Europe. This suggests that the Moors of Al-Andalus may have included descendants of pre-Roman, pre-Phoenician, and even pre-Egyptian peoples who had long histories in the Western Mediterranean. So who were the Moors really? Were they black Saracen warriors, white Berber nobles, Arab scholars, or Iberian Celtic descendants cloaked in a new religion? Or were they all of the above, pulled together into a single name, Moor, that flattened centuries of layered history into a simple conquest narrative? Think about the legends from Galicia and northern Portugal, the tales of the Morda Encantada, the enchanted people said to dwell in ancient megalithic sites, guarding hidden treasures and waiting to be released from a spell. Now consider the Spanish word for Moors, Moros, and its feminine form, Moras. The linguistic overlap is too close to ignore. What if the term Moors isn't just a label for Islamic invaders, but a distorted memory of something much older? Another thing that doesn't really add up is the Moorish architecture itself. When we look at Islamic structures in the Middle East, in places like Syria, Iraq, or Iran, we see a completely different architectural language. The focus is inward, on shade, airflow, and geometric spiritual aesthetics. You don't find much in the way of fortified towers, high outer walls, or battlements. But in Spain, we suddenly get all of that. Massive fortress-like structures that look more like European castles than Islamic temples. The so-called Alcazabas and Alcazars of Spain, like those in Malaga, Toledo, and Sevilla, feature thick stone walls, battlements, towers, and high ground placements. These are classic defensive military designs, and something you'd expect from a culture whose architectural roots supposedly lie in the Levant or North Africa. So what happened? The mainstream will tell you that these were multi-use complexes, part palace, part fortress, part religious center. But the question is, why would recently arrived Berbers from North Africa suddenly start building hybrid mosque castles in a European style that they didn't use back home? There's no clear precedent for this in early Islamic North Africa, and even in the famed citadel of Aleppo, we see a very different design logic. Functional, yes, but not monumental in the same way as the Alhambra or Mezquita of Córdoba. What if what we call Moorish architecture is really just a surviving infrastructure of a lost civilization, what we now call Tartarian? Okay, so let's just take a look at examples. Where do you think the earliest and most impressive Islamic architecture originates? If we follow the mainstream narrative, we'd expect the heart of it to be on the Arabian Peninsula, the birthplace of Islam itself. But that's not the case. In fact, pre-11th century architecture from Arabia looks nothing like what we call Moorish architecture. There are no sprawling arches, no intricate courtyards, no stone fortress complexes like we see in Spain. The early Islamic structures in Arabia are modest at best. Simple mosque, mud brick construction, flat roofs, and minimal ornamentation. The design language we associate with Al-Andalus is simply absent from its supposed source. You might then point to North Africa, but even there, the evidence is underwhelming. The only major early Islamic structure of note is the Great Mosque of Kairouan in Tunisia, and even that dates from the 9th century, later than the construction of some Iberian sites, and sits on the ruins of Carthage, which had long-standing connections to the Iberian Peninsula. In other words, this was a Romanized region that had already absorbed architectural knowledge from the Western Mediterranean. If anything, the architecture of Kairouan draws from the same pool as Spain, not the other way around. So where do we actually find the most advanced, earliest and best preserved examples of what we call Islamic architecture? Spain, specifically the Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba. with its iconic double-tiered arches, forest of Roman columns, and vast hypostyle hall. This structure, attributed to the 8th century, wasn't built in the Arabian or North African style. It was built using Roman, Visigothic, and even pre-Roman techniques, blended with an entirely new aesthetic. But the thing is, the Mosque of Cordova wasn't built from scratch. It was constructed on the foundations of a Visigothic Christian church, which itself stood on top of an older Roman temple. Many of its columns and capitals were reused, lifted directly from earlier structures. So we have to ask, was this architectural explosion really an Islamic innovation, or the continuation of an older Iberian tradition, just under new management? The style we call Moorish may not have been imported, and may have evolved in place. It may have emerged from the bones of a pre-existing advanced civilization, one with access to Roman engineering, Visigothic craftsmanship, and perhaps even Atlantean or Tartessian knowledge, all later repackaged under Islamic rule. It's not just Cordova. Across the entire Islamic world, there are no clear examples between the 7th and 9th centuries that match the scale, complexity, or architectural fusion seen in Cordova, Madinat al-Zahra, or the early phases of the Alcazar of Sevilla. In the Arabian Peninsula, early Islamic architecture was largely modest and utilitarian, far removed from the monumental stone-built precision of Spain. Even in North Africa, the few standout examples like Kairouan are either Roman-influenced or developed after Al-Andalus was already flourishing. There is one example of Umayyad architecture in Syria that historians claim predates Cordova. The Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, said to have been completed in 715 AD. However, the structure raises serious questions. Its style is overwhelmingly Roman and Byzantine, and it was in fact built on the foundations of a Byzantine cathedral, which itself had been constructed atop a massive Roman temple of Jupiter. The mosque appears more inherited than invented. What's more, nearby ruins of the original Roman temple still stand, featuring columns and stonework in the same style, further emphasizing the site's classical architectural origins. The narrative suggests that Damascus, made the capital in 661, produced this monumental mosque within just a few decades, despite no previous Islamic structures of similar sophistication in the region. This feels less like a natural progression and more like a historical graft, retroactively tying an existing Roman-Byzantine complex to the rising Islamic narrative. It's no surprise then that the site is simply dubbed the Umayyad Mosque, a label that conveniently overrides the deeper architectural lineage. So we got a problem in the mainstream narrative. And it's more than just architecture. So according to the official history, the Umayyad conquest of Iberia happened during what's commonly referred to as the Dark Ages, a time of widespread decline, cultural stagnation, and societal collapse across much of Europe. And yet, we're supposed to believe that a small force of desert nomads, with limited resources and no architectural tradition to speak of, swept through the entire Iberian Peninsula in just a few years and went on to establish one of the most sophisticated and enlightened civilizations in medieval Europe. While the rest of Europe was supposedly crawling through the mud, losing literacy, forgetting how to build in stone, and fragmenting into feudal warbands, Al-Andalus was somehow producing multi-ethnic urban centers, scientific academies, lit streets, public baths, advanced irrigation and sewer systems, monumental architecture, and libraries said to house hundreds of thousands of volumes. Cities like Cordova were described as having hundreds of mosques, schools, and hospitals, while many European cities at the time didn't even have paved roads. We're told this civilizational leap came almost overnight, courtesy of a few thousand desert nomads. Does that really make sense? By the 10th century, Cordova had become the intellectual heart of Europe, a city that rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople in scale, literacy, and scientific output. Yet even those famed capitals, for all their prestige, lacked architectural achievements on par with Cordova's monumental design, engineering precision, and urban planning. Nothing in Baghdad or Constantinople at the time matched the sophistication of the mosque cathedral, Madinat al-Zahra, or the illuminated streets and public infrastructure that defined Al-Andalus. Travelers and diplomats from Christian Europe were stunned by its sophistication. It boasted public libraries, botanical gardens, and running water, while cities like Paris and London were still largely wooded and unsewered. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to Córdoba to study medicine, astronomy, law, mathematics, and philosophy. It was here that the lost Greek texts were preserved and translated, not only into Arabic, but also into Latin, eventually fueling the European Renaissance centuries later. From an intellectual and artistic standpoint, it seems clear that much of this knowledge originated in the Iberian Peninsula and spread eastward. So why are we told the opposite? That civilization began in the Levant and moved from east to west. This narrative has been carefully constructed by historians to obscure the true origins of our past. We are told that Islam began at the start of the 7th century, with the life of the Prophet Muhammad traditionally placed between 570 and 632 AD. Almost immediately after his death, we're asked to believe that tribal, recently unified Arab clans, who just a generation prior were largely illiterate and semi-nomadic, suddenly transformed into a hyper-organized, expansive imperial force capable of overrunning vast regions of the Byzantine and Persian empires. And within just a few decades, this brand new religion, language, and empire not only conquered the Levant and North Africa, but made its way into the Iberian Peninsula and supposedly established one of the most enlightened and architecturally stunning civilizations Europe had ever seen: Al-Andalus. Just stop and think about that for a second. Within 70 years of its supposed origin, Islam had already reached the westernmost edge of Europe, supposedly founded Córdoba as a cultural and scientific capital, and built structures that still awe architects today. That timeline's just ludicrous. Where are the logistics? Where are the training periods, the economic foundations, the learning curves? How does a people go from oral tribal traditions in the Arabian Peninsula to building palatial fortresses, bathhouses, and astronomical observatories in Spain within a single lifetime? This rapid expansion has all the hallmarks of a retrofitted historical narrative, a post hoc explanation to rationalize a layer of civilization that pre-existed the official Islamic empire. There was no archaeological transition. The cities of Al-Andalus, like Córdoba, Sevilla, and Toledo, do not show signs of being built from scratch. Their core structures already existed. There are also coinage anomalies. Early Islamic coins often carry mixed Christian and Arabic inscriptions, or look suspiciously like restruck Roman coins. Were these really new empires or simply rebranded administrations? We are told that the Umayyads brought their architectural style from Damascus, yet the buildings in Spain show more affinity with Visigothic and Roman traditions than with the Levantine or North African ones. Why does this style improve the further west you go? It's a civilization supposedly started in the east. We also have to consider chronological compression. As Fomenko and others suggest, much of what we call early Islamic history could have taken place centuries later than claimed, compressed to create a more dramatic narrative of rise and fall, conquest, and continuity. What we now call Tartaria is often placed far to the east, somewhere between the steppes of Russia and Central Asia. But what if it actually began in the west? Let's consider the so-called Byzantine Empire. On paper, it's the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. But its aesthetics, its engineering, its symbolic systems, domes, arches, mosaics, aqueducts, are far more aligned with what we see later in Islamic Spain than anything truly Greco-Roman. Now again, bring in the Moorish Empire, supposedly the Berber-led Islamic conquest from North Africa that swept into Iberia in the 8th century. But the technological and architectural accomplishments attributed to this conquest, advanced irrigation, domed cathedrals, mathematical harmonics, mosaic art, city grids, are far beyond what should have been possible for a small band of desert nomads. Both the Byzantines and the Moors may not have been separate empires at all. They may have been regional branches of a larger Eurasian imperial order, a Tartarian empire whose core infrastructure and culture was later divided, renamed, and distorted. This would explain why Moorish architecture in Spain looks like the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Why Arabic coins, swords, and inscriptions are found in Russia, North Europe, and Iberia. Why early Islamic mosques reused Roman pillars that matched those in Byzantine churches. Why the Byzantine elite and the Andalusian elite had access to the same scientific and artistic systems, geometry, star maps, water engineering. Why both empires supposedly peaked during the Dark Ages, a period we're told was full of chaos and illiteracy everywhere else in Europe. And if the so-called Byzantine and Moorish empires were just names applied after the fact, then what we're really seeing is the remnants of one global order, fractured by time, natural disaster, or a political reset, and then retroactively wrapped in stories of Islamic conquest or Christian decline. There is evidence to support this, like out-of-place Arabic artifacts. Many Arabic coins were found in Northern Europe and Russia. Arabic dirhams, silver coins with Kufic script, have been found in Scandinavia, the Baltic, Ukraine, and Russia in astonishing numbers and strange context. At Timorevo, near Yaroslavl, Russia, archaeologists uncovered one of the largest deposits of Arabic coins ever found in Northern Europe. Runic inscriptions were scratched into many of these coins, suggesting direct interaction between Arabic and Norse cultures. These coins often predate the supposed Viking Islamic contact and appear in areas supposedly untouched by Islamic expansion. But the issue is, why would Arabic currency be circulating so far from the Caliphate? And why does it appear in Christian and pagan hordes alike? According to Fomenko, Arabic script may not have been exclusive to Islam, but rather the imperial script of a Eurasian power, used administratively, like Latin in the West, or Cyrillic in Russia. Its wide distribution is not evidence of conquest, but of central governance. There are many Arabic inscriptions on Christian artifacts. Numerous Christian reliquaries, crosses, and illuminated manuscripts from the early medieval period include Arabic script or motifs. There's an 8th century Irish cross with Arabic on it. It literally says, "By the will of Allah." Why would that exist in Christian Ireland during a time we're told they had zero Islamic contact? A 12th century oil lamp was founded with 2 phrases. One in Greek that says, "The light of Christ is the resurrection," and another in Arabic that reads, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate." It almost seems like a religious hybrid. So are these worlds more connected than we've been told? Or was someone rewriting history to split them up? From the 11th century on, Arabic inscriptions start popping up all over Christian kingdoms in Spain, especially in Castilla and Aragon. And we're not talking about stolen stones or leftover decorations. These were deliberately incorporated into Christian buildings. Why, if Arabic was supposedly the enemy's language, why were the most powerful Christian rulers using it in their architecture? One of the strangest anomalies in medieval Christian regalia is the coronation mantle of the Holy Roman Emperors, an opulent robe embroidered in Arabic Kufic script. Created in Palermo around 1133 AD under King Roger II of Sicily. This was not just some imported luxury item. It became part of the official coronation outfit used by Christian emperors for centuries. The Arabic inscription literally praises the ruler in royal workshop, wishing for victory and prosperity, written in the very script supposedly from a rival religious empire. Why would one of the most important symbols of Christian imperial authority be covered in Islamic calligraphy? One of the most overlooked and bizarre details in medieval Christian art is the use of what historians call pseudo-Kufic. They say these are supposedly ornamental imitations of Arabic script, found in halos, borders, and robes of biblical figures, especially in depictions of the Virgin Mary or Christ. It appears heavily in European religious paintings, manuscripts, and even architecture from the 11th to 15th centuries. The mainstream explanation is that European artists were merely copying the exotic look of Arabic writing without understanding it, like a decorative motif. But that excuse falls apart when you realize how consistently and deliberately this style is applied in high-status Christian iconography. So the real question is, why would Christian artists obsessively include Arabic-looking script and holy imagery if Islam was supposed to be a hostile foreign religion? Why do we find these motifs and depictions of Mary, Jesus, and the angels? The term pseudo is just a modern patch to cover up that Arabic wasn't foreign at all. It may have been part of the elite or liturgical language system used across both Islamic and Christian domains. In the Hagia Sophia, long before its conversion to a mosque, we already find Arabic-style motifs coexisting with Christian iconography. This raises serious questions. Why would a supposedly Christian basilica, constructed in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, already contain aesthetics and symbolic overlap with a religion that hadn't even been founded yet? If Islam hadn't even begun by 537 AD, why do these early Byzantine motifs look proto-Islamic? Why were older pillars repurposed instead of newly built, especially for the most important Christian structure of its time? But even stranger is the presence of runic graffiti, inscriptions in the ancient Norse alphabet, carved into the marble balustrades and upper galleries of the Hagia Sophia. The runic marks are real, verified by archaeologists, and are said to have been left by Varangian guards, elite Viking mercenaries who served the Byzantine emperors. The mainstream claim is that these Norsemen visited Constantinople between the 9th and 11th centuries as hired warriors. But think about it. We're supposed to believe they casually vandalized the most important Christian structure of the era, and it's just dismissed as harmless graffiti? That explanation doesn't really add up. It's more likely these marks point to a deeper presence or influence that's being downplayed. So why are Arabic symbols so prevalent in supposedly Christian artifacts from before Islamic conquest of those regions? It would seem that the divisions between Christian and Islamic art may be false dichotomies, retroactively applied during later religious rewrites. The original culture may have had a shared visual language, and the later conquerors merely rebranded what already existed. The famous helmet of the Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, now housed in the Kremlin armory, is adorned with Arabic script, despite Ivan being a staunch Orthodox Christian and the symbolic scourge of Islamic Tartars. Why would the ruler of Orthodox Russia wear regalia inscribed in Arabic? It would seem that Arabic script wasn't a sign of Islamic allegiance, but imperial legitimacy. It may reflect an older empire's influence, one that spanned from Spain to Siberia before modern religious lines were drawn. Another strange thing is these recycled pillars and mosques across the continents. One of the strangest repeating stories in Islamic architectural history is the alleged reuse of Roman, Greek, or Visigothic pillars and mosques. The Great Mosque of Cordova, said to reuse Visigothic and Roman columns. The Great Mosque of Kairouan features hundreds of mismatched ancient columns imported from Carthage. The Mosque of Amir ibn al-As in Cairo, also said to reuse Roman Byzantine columns. Even Damascus and Aleppo's mosque have spolia explanations. Why do all these mosques spanning Africa, Europe, and the Levant repeat the same implausible excuse for their architectural precision? Could this repetition be a cover-up for a far simpler explanation? That these were not reused at all, but built by an earlier shared imperial culture, whose building techniques and sacred geometry were inherited, not stolen. Many will think that the idea of Arabic originating in Europe is a stretch, simply because they've been taught it's a Semitic language tied to the Levant. But that assumption rests on the same east-to-west model of civilizational movement that's been drilled into us. The truth is, there are clear linguistic overlaps between Hebrew and Gaelic, and we've already shown how early Phoenician is nearly identical to ancient Irish. So the real question isn't whether the languages are related, it's which one came first. From Connor McDarry, quote, "The Semitic languages also are all varieties of one form of speech. though we do not know the primitive language from which the Semitic dialects diverged. Yet we know that at one time such language must have existed. We can well understand how both Sanskrit and Hebrew may have proceeded from one common source. They are both channels supplied from one river. All that he had to do was to look across the narrow sea which separates England from Ireland and find it there." End quote. Quote, "Hebrew was a secret dialect which was devised by the Irish priesthood to preserve their secret lore and rituals. Its use was kept exclusively for the priest, thereby keeping all knowledge of sacerdotal things from the uninitiated or the laity. As it was composed and made use by the Irish priest of Iessa to preserve their secret lore, it was taken over and made use of by the Roman Church to conceal and to make plausible the secret fraud which she had perpetrated upon the Christian world. This explains why it was said that only one copy of the original first scriptures was written in Hebrew, and this also shows us why Hebrew is so nearly like the Irish language." End quote. During the Middle Ages, Spain's Jewish community was larger than all of the European countries combined, and they weren't speaking Hebrew. They were in fact not only speaking Arabic, but used it for nearly everything they wrote, including religious works. This means that the majority of Jews throughout this period were primarily speaking Arabic. Quote, "For most of the last 1400 years, Arabic, in its Jewish form, was spoken by more Jews than any other language. From the 7th until the end of the 17th centuries, the majority of the world's Jews lived in the Dar al-Islam domain of Islam. Furthermore, Arabic was spoken or used as a cultural language by Jews across a greater geographical expanse than any other language was." End quote. This would hint towards a great deception, and according to Fomenko, he claims that many historical events don't correspond mathematically with the dates they are said to have occurred. He contends that all of the ancient histories of Greece, Rome, and Egypt are just a reflection of things that actually occurred in the Middle Ages, while asserting that Chinese and Arab history are fabrications of 17th and 18th century Jesuits. Fomenko and Oleg's theories both point to significant holes in our historical timelines, and Spain's early medieval period showcases this perfectly. For instance, with Charlemagne, who may have never have existed as described. The famous Song of Roland, a cornerstone of Carolingian legend, recast a historically documented ambush by Basque as a grand battle against Islamic forces. If a simple border skirmish was transformed into a mythic struggle against invading Muslims, how many other foundational events were similarly distorted? If true, this would mean that Charlemagne and his entire era were retroactively inserted into history. Oleg specifically names Charlemagne as a phantom emperor, a legendary figure concocted by medieval scribes to pad out chronology. Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II around AD 1000 are accused of having adjusted calendars or documents to make it seem like the year 1000 had arrived, when in reality, only 700 years had passed since the 1st century. To bridge that gap, chroniclers would have invented or greatly embellished figures like Charlemagne to occupy the non-existent 8th to 9th centuries. There is also the calendar discrepancy. By the Gregorian reform of 1582, the Julian calendar had drifted by 10 days, whereas it should have drifted 13 days if 1600 years had truly passed since Julius Caesar's time, suggesting that roughly 3 centuries worth of days never actually elapsed. All of this fits conveniently in the time around the Moorish conquest of Spain. And interestingly, there's a legend that had grown up to explain why the Moors so easily overcame Roderick. The tale goes that Count Julian, a Visigothic noble, sought revenge on Roderick for dishonoring, in some versions our wording, his daughter Florinda, often called La Cava. Julian allegedly invited the Muslim forces to invade Iberia as payback against Roderick. This dramatic story became part of popular history. However, it does not appear in any source until centuries after the events. In fact, there is no evidence for Florinda La Cava's existence at all. Her character is regarded as a later concoction. The earliest mention of the tale is an 11th century Arabic chronicle, and it then appears in a 12th century Latin Christian chronicle long after 711 AD. That the legend was retroactively inserted centuries later suggests the narrative of Roderick's fall was rewritten to include a moralizing story, blaming the loss of Spain on the king's sin. If one applies the phantom time idea, the early 8th century Islamic conquest of Spain falls squarely inside the missing years. Indeed, Alig explicitly includes the Muslim conquest of Iberia in the period he believes was fabricated. In other words, the 711 AD invasion may not have happened as recorded, or at all. It could have been invented by later Christian chroniclers to retroactively explain Islamic influence in Spain. I plan on doing in-depth videos on individual locations, but before ending part 1, I want to highlight some of Spain's most intriguing architecture from multiple eras. These sites seem to defy the mainstream historical narrative. Here's a detailed list of Spain's architecture that I find particularly suspect. The Great Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba. This is one of the craziest examples. I can't wait to talk more about it, but this supposed mosque was built on a Visigothic church, which itself is on Roman ruins, and then the Catholics decided to build a huge cathedral right in the middle of the mosque. Alhambra, Granada. Its intricate geometry and advanced hydraulic systems suggest a level of sophistication oddly unmatched in contemporary North Africa. Many of its features, like the Court of the Lions and Muqarna ceilings, feel less like Islamic innovation and more like echoes of a much older architectural tradition that someone inherited rather than invented. The Alcazars across Spain. From Sevilla to Segovia and Córdoba, these so-called Christian palaces or Moorish castles were built in unmistakably Islamic styles, often directly on top of older Moorish or Visigothic foundations. Why would Christian monarchs, fresh from reconquest, continue building in the exact architectural language of the culture they supposedly overthrew? The Toledo Cathedral. Built over a mosque, its foundations are older still, Visigothic in origin. The engineering involved in this structure is staggering for its time, with vaulted ceilings, acoustics, and precise symmetry that would challenge even modern builders. Even the cathedral's main tower, tall, spiraled, and oddly mechanical in appearance, almost looks more like a device or instrument than a religious bell tower. The Sevilla Cathedral, claimed to be the largest Gothic cathedral in the world, it was constructed in the early 1400s, right after centuries of war, famine, and instability. How exactly did they pull off such an enormous, detailed feat of architecture during a supposedly primitive time? And then there's the Giralda in Sevilla, initially a minaret, then converted to a bell tower. What was it originally intended to signify? The fact that this towering Islamic structure was not torn down but instead preserved and integrated into the heart of a Christian cathedral complex raises serious questions about the continuity of power and culture. The Tower of Hercules in Galicia. We talked about this earlier, but the Roman lighthouse is suspiciously intact compared to contemporaries and tied directly to Irish mythical origins. However, nearby are the walls of Lugo. Claimed to be Roman and dated to the 3rd century AD, these walls completely encircle the old city of Lugo, with over 80 towers in a continuous loop stretching over 2 kilometers. But what's weird is they don't look Roman. There are no grand arches, no Latin inscriptions, no classical flourishes. Instead, the design resembles medieval English castles, thick, utilitarian, almost fortress-like in the Northern European way. Even stranger, these are considered the only fully intact Roman defensive walls in the world. Not in Rome, not in the heart of the empire, but all the way out in remote Galicia? How did this outpost preserve its walls flawlessly over 1700 years while every major Roman capital crumbled? Seems more logical that they were never Roman to begin with. The Aqueduct of Segovia. Built without mortar, its stability and precision defy supposed Roman technological limits of the time. It spans nearly 15 kilometers and rises over 90 feet in places, with 167 granite arches perfectly balanced. No concrete, no clamps, just stone. And just look how it towers over the modern city like it was dropped in from another age. Imagine what it would actually take to build something like this in the 1st century, with no power tools, no cranes, and just primitive technology. It doesn't add up. And then they say these are Roman aqueducts. But how do we know that for sure? The most astonishing examples of this kind of construction aren't even in Rome. They're in Spain and France, with Segovia and Tarragona being the two of the clearest examples. Two other great examples would be the one in Merida, called the Aqueduct of the Miracles, and then the Aqueduct of Saxe. France has Pont du Gard, and Turkey has the Valens Aqueduct, but even those don't dominate their landscapes like the way Segovia does. There is one in Rome, like Aqua Claudia, but it's mostly in ruins and nowhere near as precise or preserved. So why are the most advanced and best preserved aqueducts not in the Roman capital, but instead far out in what was supposed to be the empire's western frontier? Were these really just water channels, or could they have served a very different function? And more importantly, who really built them? Then there's the Bridge of Alcantara in Extremadura. Built at the end of the 1st century, this massive bridge has enduring construction seemingly disproportionate for a remote region in Roman Iberia. Interestingly, it shares many design features with the region's aqueducts: precise stonework, monumental arches, and no mortar. The Cathedral of Lyon, said to have been started in the 13th century and completed by the 15th. This Gothic masterpiece rises out of Lyon like something from another world. The stained glass alone, over 1,800 square meters of it, is some of the oldest and most complex in Europe, rivaling anything in France. The sheer scale, precision, and light manipulation in the structure feels almost unrepeatable even today. Italica in Sevilla, an advanced city layout and infrastructure for supposedly a peripheral Roman outpost. Was this really a Roman flourishing center? The scale of its amphitheater alone, capable of seating over 2,500 people, is absurd for a provincial town, suggesting this was a major hub long before the official Roman footprint. The Palace of Madrid. It was begun in 1735 after the original Moorish Alcazar burned down, yet the new structure was built directly on the same foundation. With over 3,000 rooms, towering columns, sweeping grand staircases, and walls of white limestone and granite, it's the largest functioning royal palace in Europe. Puente Nuevo in Ronda, built between 1759 and 1793, and possibly built over a deep gorge with 18th century technology, hinting at lost engineering knowledge. This towering stone bridge spans a 120-meter deep gorge connecting two cliff faces in the mountain city of Ronda. The foundation drops straight into the abyss, anchored into vertical rock walls with a level of engineering that even today would be a logistical nightmare. And there's a hidden chamber that was supposedly used as a prison. Oh, and I thought this was weird. There's the Ciudad Encantada, which translates into Enchanted City, which is in Cuenca. It's these natural rock formations that eerily resemble ruined architecture, possibly hiding intentionally buried or destroyed ancient structures. These towering stone buildings, arches, and what look like collapsed columns scatter the landscape like the fossilized remains of a lost city. The official explanation chalks it up to millions of years of wind and water erosion, but some of the formations have sharp angles, perfect overhangs, and stacked shapes that look more sculpted than weathered. Entire sections resemble giant gates, halls, or petrified monuments, as if this was once a built environment now passed off as geology. It is hard to believe that this was all accidental. What if this is the aftermath of a cataclysm, with the stone melted, fractured, or fused into what we now call natural? There are many more places to explore, but for now, this should be enough to show that the official story doesn't quite hold up. Alright, so that wraps up part 1 of Spain Unveiled. We went through the official timeline, looked at some strange gaps in the story, and started digging into the older layers of Spain's past, the ones nobody really talks about. We covered a lot: Tartessos, the Basques, the idea that Arabic and Islamic architecture might have actually started in Spain, and even the possibility that a huge chunk of history was made up. And yes, it might sound crazy, but once you start noticing the holes, it's hard to unsee. So the question is, who really built these cities? Was there a lost civilization underneath all of this? And if so, why was it erased? This is just the beginning. In the next part, we will be discussing the Mosque Cathedral in Cordova, and I will talk about my visit there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in part 2, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?